August 4th, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin. The sea is slick with diesel, the air heavy, and the only light is the eerie green glow of radar screens searching for ghosts in the inky blackness. History books claim this night launched a crusade for democracy, but the ledgers tell a story far more insidious. Vietnam was no mere military quagmire. For those behind the curtain, it was the ultimate money-printing machine. Sink, a staggering $140 billion equivalent to over $1 trillion in today's value, was extracted from the pockets of hardworking taxpayers and poured directly into the coffers of private defense contractors. You might call it a blunder, a tragic failure, but for the architects of this system, it was a triumph. It operated with chilling, mathematical precision, achieving exactly what it was programmed for: perpetual profit. To understand why America sacrificed 2 decades for a war it demonstrably couldn't win, we don't look at military maps. We follow the money all the way back to the ashes of 1945, where a dark economic doctrine was born, designed to transform conflict into prosperity and turn human blood into dancing numbers on a stock ticker. 10 years of the New Deal, with its alphabet soup of agencies and ambitious public works programs, had failed to achieve full employment. But 4 years of total war mobilization of relentless industrial output had accomplished it in a mere 18 months. Factories roared back to life. Unemployment vanished as millions donned uniforms or took up positions on the assembly line. The economy exploded, growing at rates previously unimaginable. And when the guns fell silent, economists began to ask a dangerous, unsettling question. What if we just kept doing this? The answer, cloaked in academic jargon and justified by Cold War anxieties, came in the form of military Keynesianism, the deliberate use of defense spending as a permanent, ever-present tool for managing the economy. From 1950 to 1978, defense spending never dipped below 9% of the gross domestic product. Not during periods of relative peace, not during economic downturns, never. This was no longer business as usual. This was a fundamental, tectonic shift in the way America's economy functioned, a reliance on conflict to fuel prosperity. In April 1950, the National Security Council, a body operating largely in the shadows, produced a top-secret memorandum known as NSC 68, authored primarily by Paul Nitze, a hawkish State Department official. It called for massive, across-the-board increases in defense spending to counter the perceived threat of Soviet expansionism. But here's the truly remarkable, almost cynical part. Nitze himself later admitted that the Korean War, erupting a mere 2 months after the unveiling of NSC 68, came along and saved us from political resistance to these spending increases. Saved them, as if war were merely a convenient solution to a nagging economic problem. This created precisely the kind of environment that President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a former 5-star general who understood the seductive allure of military power, would famously warn against in his 1961 farewell address. He cautioned against the burgeoning power of what he termed the military-industrial complex. We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex, defense contractors eager for lucrative government contracts, sprawling military establishments hungry for resources and expansion, congressional districts utterly dependent on defense-related employment, entire regions of the country strategically oriented toward military production. They all coalesced into an interlocking system, bound together by one shared, overriding interest: perpetual conflict. But how exactly did this influence manifest in the halls of power? The defense industry perfected a strategy of spreading production across as many congressional districts as possible. By manufacturing wings in California and engines in Connecticut, they created a political hostage situation where no congressman dared to vote against military spending for fear of local job losses. This lobbying machine was fueled by a revolving door, employing former generals and Pentagon officials who used their old connections to keep defense budgets at record highs. But Vietnam wasn't solely about maintaining artificially inflated defense budgets. It was also, crucially, about resources. Southeast Asia in the 1950s and 60s held dominion over critical natural resources, commodities desperately needed by Western industrial economies to maintain their competitive edge. A 1954 National Security Council report, chillingly prescient, explicitly warned that losing Southeast Asia to communism would deprive the free world of vital resources, including strategically important tin and rubber, leading to serious, cascading economic consequences for a multitude of nations. Vietnam itself possessed significant rubber plantation, legacies of French colonial exploitation, and valuable coal deposits. But the surrounding region was even richer. Malaya's economy, for example, was almost entirely dependent, roughly 85%, on exports of tin and rubber. Indonesia possessed vast reserves of oil, black gold that fueled the engines of industry. This profiteering extended even to the most basic lifeblood of the war, fuel. While the U.S. shipped 45 million gallons of fuel monthly, oil giants like Exxon and Mobil charged the military 35 cents per gallon, nearly triple the commercial rate. Even more scandalous, companies like Shell utilized refineries in neutral countries to indirectly supply fuel to North Vietnam, meaning American taxpayers were effectively funding both sides of the conflict, while the oil companies profited from everyone. And the fertile rice bowls of the Mekong Delta fed much of Asia, a strategically important food source. This wasn't simply a battle of ideologies, a clash between competing political systems. This was, at its core, about maintaining Western access to the raw materials that kept factories humming. From the sprawling automotive plants of Detroit to the industrial heartlands of Dusseldorf, the economic dimension of the containment policy, the doctrine of preventing the spread of communism, cannot be disentangled from these cold, hard resource considerations. American policymakers viewed economic stability in Southeast Asia, meaning stability favorable to Western interests, as absolutely essential to preventing the spread of communist influence. And that stability, in their view, hinged on maintaining unfettered access to strategic commodities. The traditional economic model of the region had long been predicated on the export of vital raw materials like rice, rubber, tin, and sugar. American intervention, therefore, aimed not only to contain communism, but to forcibly preserve this integration into the global capitalist world economy. So when Lyndon B. Johnson dramatically escalated the war in 1964, he wasn't simply reacting to a dubious, possibly fabricated, incident involving torpedo attacks in the Gulf of Tonkin. He was, in reality, activating a complex and deeply entrenched economic architecture that had been meticulously constructed over the preceding 15 years, an architecture meticulously designed to profit handsomely from precisely this kind of prolonged conflict. The stark numbers tell a more compelling story of escalation than any soaring political speech ever could. In 1964, U.S. military spending in Vietnam totaled a relatively modest $700 million. Just 1 year later, as Johnson committed hundreds of thousands of ground troops and dramatically expanded aerial bombing operations, those costs exploded to several billion dollars. By 1968 and 1969, at the height of the war, annual expenditures had reached a staggering $25 to $28 billion, equivalent to roughly 1% of the entire U.S. gross domestic product. But even those mind-boggling figures failed to fully capture the true economic burden of the war. A 1967 investigation conducted by the Joint Economic Committee revealed that official estimates systematically concealed the war's true cost. Deliberately obscuring the financial realities, the committee found that actual fiscal year 1967 expenditures totaled approximately $20 billion, fully double the Johnson administration's original, publicly stated estimate of $10 billion. This wasn't a mere miscalculation, an honest error in accounting. This was deliberate obscuration, a calculated effort to mislead the American public. This money printing machine was protected by a wall of silence and self-censorship. While media outlets showed combat, they rarely followed the money. Defense contractors were major advertisers, and many editors feared that exposing profiteering would be labeled unpatriotic or hurt national morale. One New York Times reporter spent months documenting military corruption, only to have his story killed by editors because it was too critical during wartime. This lack of oversight allowed ridiculous charges to go unnoticed, like the military paying $600 for a simple hammer or $9,000 for a standard wrench. Johnson administration officials openly conceded that establishing a clear, definitive distinction between Vietnam-related outlays and other, more general defense disbursements was, in their words, somewhat unrealistic. Translation: they were cleverly mixing war costs into the overall defense budget, effectively hiding how much Vietnam was truly consuming. The incremental cost, the expense beyond normal peacetime military operations, was deliberately hidden from view to minimize political opposition, to prevent the anti-war movement from gaining further momentum. While the government focused on managing the numbers, it simultaneously perfected the art of masking the human reality behind the spreadsheets. And there was another, perhaps even more politically sensitive, reason for concealing the true costs. Johnson was simultaneously attempting to launch his ambitious Great Society programs, an ambitious domestic agenda designed to eradicate poverty, expand access to education, and provide health care for the elderly and the poor. He knew he couldn't openly ask the American people to choose between guns and butter, between funding a distant war and investing in their own communities. So he tried to pursue both simultaneously, while systematically lying about the true cost of each. Robert Collins, in his meticulous analysis of the period, convincingly demonstrates that the Vietnam War constituted the second major source of the economic crisis of 1968, standing alongside Johnson's Great Society programs as a primary driver of instability. The strategy of pursuing simultaneous military escalation, abroad and ambitious social spending, increases at home created unprecedented fiscal pressures, pushing the American economy to its breaking point. Johnson deliberately underreported the costs of the war to protect his cherished domestic agenda, fearing that acknowledging the true expense would empower fiscal conservatives, providing them with ammunition to dismantle the Great Society piece by piece. But here's where the financial logic takes an even darker turn. Previous American wars, World War II and Korea, had been largely financed through increased taxation. Citizens were explicitly asked to make sacrifices, to contribute directly to the war effort through higher taxes. Johnson stubbornly refused to follow this precedent. Instead, he opted for deficit financing, simply printing money and spending it, allowing the national debt to balloon, and letting inflation do the dirty work of quietly transferring wealth from ordinary Americans to the well-connected war contractors. The flow of wealth wasn't just in bombs and oil. It was in every single transaction. Banks like Chase Manhattan and Bank of America established massive operations in Vietnam, charging fees for every paycheck sent home by 500,000 troops, generating hundreds of millions in transaction revenue. Some institutions even engaged in currency speculation, using inside knowledge of upcoming military operations to trade against regional currencies. Why? Because raising taxes would have required admitting the war's true, staggering cost. It would have forced Americans to make a clear, unavoidable choice: the war or the Great Society. And Johnson, acutely aware of public sentiment, knew which one they would choose. The war was already deeply unpopular by 1966, viewed by many as a senseless quagmire. Asking Americans to directly pay for it would have been political suicide, a gamble Johnson was unwilling to take. So, the government spent and spent and spent, fueling a runaway inflationary spiral. By 1977, the combination of spiraling war spending and ambitious domestic programs had created dangerous inflationary pressures, threatening to destabilize the entire economy. Johnson's own economic advisors, increasingly alarmed, urged fiscal restraint, desperately pleading with the president to curb spending. The Federal Reserve, attempting to stem the tide, cautiously reduced money growth in late 1966, despite the ever-widening deficits. But the prevailing political climate made any sustained restrictive policy virtually impossible. Finally, in January 1967, Johnson, under intense pressure, reluctantly proposed a temporary 6% surcharge on personal and corporate income taxes, a small step designed to signal fiscal responsibility. Even then, however, congressional resistance delayed implementation for over a year. Wilbur Mills, the powerful chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, refused to advance the proposal without significant, across-the-board spending cuts. The impasse, a testament to the deep divisions within the government, continued for over a year, paralyzing economic policy. Congress finally passed the Revenue and Expenditure Control Act in 1968, which included a 10% surcharge coupled with $6 billion in spending reductions for individual taxpayers. In 1968, this amounted to approximately 5% of regular tax, generating an estimated $12 billion in the first year. But economists remained deeply skeptical about its actual effectiveness in curbing inflation. Temporary taxes, they argued, generally fail to significantly limit consumer spending. Because households tend to smooth consumption over time, people don't drastically cut back when they know a tax increase is only temporary. Instead, they borrow money, spend their savings, and continue consuming at roughly the same rate. Inflation, predictably, continued to climb after the surcharge's implementation, reaching approximately 5% by the end of Johnson's final year in office, further eroding the purchasing power of ordinary Americans. The political economy at play here is particularly revealing, as the book War and Taxes meticulously documents. Raising taxes in the wake of prior tax cuts for Vietnam threatened the fragile coalition Johnson had painstakingly built around the Great Society. The president, gambling that the economy could somehow absorb the massive expenditures for both defense and social programs, chose to bet against sound economic principles. It was a bet that ultimately proved catastrophically wrong, contributing to the economic turmoil that would plague the nation for years to come. Now, let's delve into the sheer scale of the financial commitment, because the official numbers, as deliberately obscured as they were, still fail to fully capture the staggering economic burden of this protracted and ultimately futile war. The total direct cost of the Vietnam War reached approximately $140 billion in 1960s currency. To put that into perspective, adjusted for inflation, that's equivalent to over $1 trillion in today's money for a war that America demonstrably lost. A conflict that achieved none of its publicly stated objectives. $140 billion, roughly the entire yearly income of a mid-sized country at the time, simply consumed and ultimately wasted. At peak spending in 1968 and 1969, the war cost approximately $28 billion per year. That represented a staggering 1% of America's entire gross domestic product, nearly 1/10 of everything America produced. All the goods and services generated in a year went towards prosecuting a war in a small, relatively insignificant country that most Americans couldn't even locate on a map before 1964. Defense indicators, closely watched barometers of military activity, vividly illustrate the intensity of the buildup. After a brief decrease in 1964, all defense indicators increased dramatically in 1965, signaling the start of the massive escalation. Military prime contracts increased by 5%. Manufacturers' new orders in defense products. Industries jumped by a staggering 5%. Progress payments, outstanding. The money flowing to defense contractors surged by 9%, all in a single year. By 1966, the pace of expansion accelerated even further. Annual rates of increase in defense indicators consistently exceeded the overall growth rate of the GDP. By 1967, increased military purchases accounted for a remarkable 9% of all GDP increases for the entire year. A full quarter of all economic growth was directly attributable to war spending, a clear indication of the conflict's distorting effect on the American economy. This internal distortion of the domestic economy was merely the first domino to fall, setting off a chain reaction that would eventually reach the very foundations of global finance. This systemic theft was hidden behind a wall of techno-strategic language designed to sanitize the horror. War planners didn't talk about killing people. They used terms like delivering the ordnance or air interdictions of hostiles. Even the dead weren't returned in body bags anymore. They were called transfer tubes. By using this clinical, bloodless language, the system disabled the public's capacity to care, making the massive expenditure on human misery feel like a routine accounting exercise. But even these massive figures miss critical, hidden costs, expenses that never appeared in official budget documents. Burton Weisbrod and Lee Hansen, in their groundbreaking research, identified several categories of expenses that were consistently overlooked in official calculations. First, the opportunity cost of draft-affected military personnel significantly exceeded their actual military compensation. Average annual civilian earning potential for draft-affected men was approximately $3,900, while military compensation, including benefits, was only $2,400, a discrepancy of $1,500 per man. With hundreds of thousands of young men serving in Vietnam, this hidden subsidy to the war effort totaled billions of dollars annually. These men, instead of carrying rifles through jungles, could have been working in factories, building businesses, attending college, contributing to the civilian economic productivity of the nation. Instead, they were engaged in a destructive and ultimately futile war, and American families bore the economic cost of that difference, the lost potential. Second, human capital losses resulting from casualties represented an enormous drain on foregone economic productivity. Gary Becker's economic estimates suggested that a 22-year-old male with a high school education represented approximately 33,000 in productive capital, the present value of everything he would earn and contribute to the economy over his lifetime, with approximately 10,000. Such individuals lost annually during the peak war years. The destruction of human capital amounted to roughly $330 million per year, and that calculation excluded the much larger numbers of wounded and psychologically traumatized veterans, men who came home missing limbs, addicted to heroin, suffering from what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. The economic value they could have created was simply erased. The families who had to care for them were often forced to withdraw from the workforce, further diminishing economic output. The veterans' benefits that would be paid out for decades, a long-term financial burden on the nation, also didn't appear in the official $140 billion figure. Third, the war imposed substantial indirect costs through inflation, balance of payments deterioration, and the opportunity costs of diverted resources. The billions spent on military operations in Vietnam could have been invested in education, transportation, communication networks, scientific research, public health, all areas that would have contributed to long-term economic growth and societal well-being. The roads not built, the schools not improved, the diseases not cured, the technologies not invented. How do you even begin to calculate costs like that? But one thing was certain, someone was getting incredibly rich from all this spending. And that brings us to the contractors, the beneficiaries of the war's economic boom. The Vietnam War enriched defense contractors through contracting mechanisms that effectively eliminated normal market discipline, rewarding inefficiency and waste. The most egregious example of this was the widespread use of cost-plus award fee contracts, which guaranteed contractors reimbursement for all of their costs, plus a predetermined percentage profit, regardless of efficiency or performance. Think about that perverse incentive structure for a moment. The more you spend, the more you make. Efficiency is actively punished. Waste is richly rewarded. Prolonging the project, stretching it out as long as possible, directly increases your profit. Representative Donald Rumsfeld. Yes, that Donald Rumsfeld, decades before he would become Secretary of Defense and architect of the Iraq War, testified before Congress in 1966 that contracts with the RMK-BRJ consortium were, in his words, illegal by statute. This consortium, comprised of Raymond International, Morrison Knudsen, Brown and Root, and G. Jones Construction, received exclusive, no-bid contracts to construct the massive military infrastructure required for American operations in Vietnam, from air bases and ports to roads and communication networks. They called themselves with a hint of self-aggrandizement the Vietnam Builders. Initial contracts, valued at a relatively modest $15 million before 1965, exploded to obligations estimated at $900 million by November 1967. $900 million, a 60-fold increase in just 2 short years. As one Morrison-Knudsen executive candidly acknowledged, all we knew was that they wanted a lot of roads, a lot of airfields, a lot of bridges, and a lot of ports, and that they probably would want it all finished by yesterday. The cost-plus structure, of course, meant that higher expenses translated directly into higher profits for the consortium members. Rumsfeld, even back then, presciently warned that the potential for waste and profiteering under such a contract is substantial. His warnings proved to be tragically prophetic. Subsequent investigations revealed systematic overcharging and blatant profiteering in areas like fuel transport and meal provision, exceeding $150 million. But these individual acts of profiteering were just symptoms of a much larger, systemic shift in how America financed its global ambitions. $150 million in pure, unadulterated theft just for fuel and food in South Vietnam. The corruption crippled the very army America was trying to support. South Vietnamese units often refused to fight because their commanders had sold their ammunition and food supplies on the black market. Weapons like the M16, which cost the U.S. $150, were sold to the highest bidder for $400. Up to 30% of all supplies shipped to Vietnam ended up on the black market, sometimes even in the hands of the Viet Cong, and the scale of this disappeared. Money is truly astronomical. After the war, investigators found that between $10 and $20 billion in spending simply vanished into a black hole of fake receipts and missing documentation. This fraud was mirrored by South Vietnamese officials, such as Prime Minister Nguyen Cao Ky, who reportedly amassed a personal fortune of $50 million through kickbacks and black market sales of American equipment, while his own soldiers went hungry. And, remarkably, nobody went to jail, nobody lost their contracts, nobody was held accountable. Because the entire system was deliberately designed this way, to insulate contractors from risk and to maximize profits, regardless of the consequences. But perhaps the most extreme profits were hidden behind the word classified. Lockheed's profit margins on secret programs like the U-2 spy plane and the SR-71 Blackbird were estimated to be over 60%, 6 times the industry average. Because the work was top secret, there was zero public oversight on costs, allowing the company to justify any price tag they wanted. The very legal structure of cost-plus contracting made it virtually impossible to distinguish between legitimate cost overruns and deliberate fraud. When your profit is a guaranteed percentage of your costs, what's the difference between simple inefficiency and outright theft? The incentive system was fundamentally broken, rewarding waste at every level. Military officers weren't judged on saving money, but on spending their entire budget. If they didn't spend it all by year-end, their budget for the next year would be cut. This led to bases filled with warehouses of unused equipment, brand new trucks that were never driven, and tools that were never even unpacked, all bought at inflated prices just to empty the accounts. To see this theft in action, look at the receipts from the front lines. Companies like Boeing charged the Air Force $1,000 for electronic components that cost only $50 to make. One procurement officer testified that parts an independent shop could build for $300 were billed at $18,000. Meanwhile, Pacific Architects and Engineers, PAE, charged the government $12 for a single light bulb and $8 for a $2 toilet seat. Knowing the military couldn't comparison shop in a war zone, they both produced the same, undeniably lucrative result: more money for you. And then there were the chemical companies, the purveyors of ecological and human disaster. Dow Chemical and Monsanto were the primary manufacturers of Agent Orange, the dioxin-contaminated herbicide that would cause lasting environmental and health devastation across Vietnam, leaving a legacy of suffering that continues to this day. Between 1971 and 1971, approximately 20 million gallons of herbicides were sprayed over South Vietnam, a deluge of poison dumped on forests, rice paddies, and villages. Agent Orange contained dioxin concentrations averaging 2 milligrams per kilogram, far higher than concentrations used domestically in the United States. The companies knew it was toxic to humans. They knew the dioxin concentrations were dangerously high. They knew what they were producing would cause cancer. birth defects, and neurological damage, and they steadfastly refused to take measures to eliminate the contamination, prioritizing short-term profits over long-term safety and ethical considerations. A 1980 settlement, reached only after a decade-long legal battle, required the main manufacturers to pay $180 million to compensate American veterans who had been exposed to the herbicide. Notice that the settlement only covered American veterans, not the millions of Vietnamese who were exposed, not the children born with horrific birth defects, not the farmland rendered toxic for generations, just American veterans. And even then, the payout barely dented the company's enormous profits. And here's a particularly revealing detail that exposes the true moral calculus at play. Monsanto's share of the settlement was approximately 45%, while Dow's was only 20%. Despite Dow having the largest share of Agent Orange sales to the government, this allocation reflected Monsanto's greater responsibility for the dioxin contamination. The fact that their product was known to be more toxic, the financial math behind this chemical warfare, was equally devastating for the taxpayers. Chemical companies like Monsanto and Dow made just $20 million selling Agent Orange to the military. Yet, the U.S. government has since spent over $50 billion on disability payments for exposed veterans. A staggering 500-to-1 ratio where the corporations took the profit and the public was left with the bill. They knew their product was more dangerous, more likely to cause harm, and they sold it anyway, prioritizing profit over human health and environmental safety. And they paid a slightly larger share of a settlement that barely registered on their balance sheets. The legacy of this profit machine is still visible in the soil and the bloodlines of Vietnam today. While the U.S. government spent $50 billion on disability payments for its own veterans, it provided only a tiny fraction, a few hundred million for the millions of Vietnamese victims. Even now, at the Da Nang Air Base, the soil remains so toxic with dioxin that weeds cannot grow, and children are still born with rare blood diseases and blindness. For the chemical companies, the war ended with a profit. For the families in Da Nang, the war never ended at all. Dow Chemical also manufactured napalm, the jellified gasoline incendiary weapon that became synonymous with the war's brutality. Napalm B, used extensively in Vietnam, was produced through simple chemistry, mixing gasoline, benzene, and polystyrene. Dow, previously ranked only 75th among military contractors and best known for Saran Wrap, became the Pentagon's sole napalm supplier, profiting handsomely from the weapon's devastating effects. Student protests erupting on college campuses across the country eventually forced other companies to cease napalm production, but Dow defiantly continued and even increased production, including at its Sarnia, Ontario plant in Canada. They wore the protests as a badge of honor, a symbol of their commitment to patriotic duty. At Dow's annual stockholder meeting in 1967, Chairman Carl Gerstacker staunchly defended napalm production, arguing that the company had a patriotic duty to provide the military with whatever weapons it requested, regardless of the ethical implications. Patriotic duty, that's what he called it. The profit motive wrapped in the flag of patriotism, a convenient justification for profiting from human suffering. Dow's napalm sales generated millions in revenue while burning Vietnamese civilians alive, but it was patriotic, so nobody could question it. Meanwhile, aerospace contractors enjoyed massive revenue increases from the unforgiving terrain of Vietnam, turned helicopters from a convenience into a necessity, and orders for rotary wing aircraft skyrocketed. Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and other giants of the burgeoning aerospace industry found themselves the recipients of extraordinarily lucrative government contracts. These weren't just for the helicopters themselves, but also for the weapon systems that armed them, the spare parts that kept them flying, and the cutting-edge technologies that made them deadly. Analyzing the profitability of these defense contractors during the Vietnam era reveals a paradox. On the one hand, some studies suggested that, on average, defense contracting was less profitable than commercial endeavors. However, a crucial caveat existed. Contractors enjoyed significantly higher earnings during periods of peak capacity utilization, precisely the environment created by the massive Vietnam buildup. the risks were undeniably higher, with the volatility of defense profits far exceeding that of commercial ventures. Yet, this risk was substantially mitigated, practically erased, by the prevalence of cost-plus contracts. Even more crucially, unwavering government guarantees. In essence, defense contractors secured a virtually risk-free scenario. They reaped the immense upside of high-stakes venture, accumulating vast profits during boom times, while being shielded from the downside by the government's commitment to covering all costs, regardless of performance. It was, as some have argued, a system of capitalism for the gains, socialism for the losses, a perfect racket. Consider the sheer magnitude of defense contractor operations during the war. Total defense contract obligations surged from approximately $26 billion in 1965 to over $44 billion by 1968. A staggering 70% increase in just 3 years. To put that in perspective, total federal revenue in 1965 was $116 billion, meaning defense contracts alone devoured over 22% of the entire federal budget. The RMK-BRJ Consortium's $900 million contract stands out as one of the largest construction projects in human history at that time. Its scale rivaled that of massive dam projects or the construction of entire cities. At its peak, the consortium employed over 51,000 workers across 125 different sites. Their accomplishments included constructing or significantly improving over 500 miles of roads, the construction of 75 tactical air bases strategically scattered throughout the country, and the creation of 26 deep-water ports capable of handling massive cargo ships. Chemical manufacturers, meanwhile, churned out staggering quantities of defoliants and incendiaries. The production of napalm, the horrific jellied gasoline mixture, reached approximately 100 million pounds during the war years. Delivered in bombs, each containing up to 750 pounds of the incendiary agent. However, perhaps no single metric captures the scale of the aerospace windfall, quite like helicopter production. Bell Helicopter alone delivered over 7,000 UH-1 Huey helicopters between 1961 and 1975, with peak production reaching an astounding 90 aircraft per month, with a unit cost of approximately $250,000. The Huey alone generated total sales of approximately $1.75 billion for a single aircraft model. Unsurprisingly, the defense industry's political influence expanded in direct proportion to its economic might. By 1968, defense-related employment, encompassing military personnel, civilian defense employees, and defense contractor workers, totaled over 8 million people. Approximately 10% of the total U.S. labor force. Congressional districts that hosted major defense facilities or contractor operations developed incredibly powerful incentives to support continued military spending, regardless of any genuine strategic necessity. However, even as defense contractors amassed unprecedented fortunes, the global financial system teetered on the brink of collapse, and the Vietnam War served as the detonator. As the internal pressure of inflation and debt mounted, the crisis inevitably spilled across borders, challenging the post-war international order itself. The Bretton Woods International Monetary System, established in 1954, anchored global currency exchange rates to the US dollar, which was, in turn, pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. The entire system rested on the premise of unwavering US fiscal and monetary discipline, necessary to maintain global confidence in the dollar's gold convertibility. Every dollar in circulation was, theoretically, backed by gold held securely in Fort Knox and other U.S. depositories. However, by the early 1960s, the amount of dollars circulating globally had already begun to exceed the United States gold reserves at the official $35 per ounce rate. The system's fundamental contradiction, brilliantly articulated in economist Robert Triffin's famous dilemma, was that providing sufficient international liquidity required the United States to run persistent balance of payments deficits. However, these very deficits simultaneously undermined confidence in the dollar's gold backing. Think of it as a trap. The world needed dollars to facilitate international trade, To supply those dollars, America was compelled to run deficits, spending more abroad than it earned. However, the more dollars that accumulated overseas, the less credible the promise became that America could actually exchange all those dollars for gold at the promised rate of $35 per ounce. The system, from its very inception, contained the seeds of its own destruction. The Vietnam War dramatically intensified this contradiction, pushing it to the breaking point. Financing the war through deficit spending, instead of through taxation, resulted in a surge of dollars flowing out of the country, fueling rampant inflation. Military spending stimulated domestic demand, which, in turn, spilled over into increased imports, while simultaneously doing nothing to enhance export competitiveness. The war created a profoundly negative trade dynamic, more dollars flowing out, fewer goods coming back in, and less gold remaining in the vaults. Foreign governments, particularly France, under the leadership of Charles de Gaulle, began to demand gold in exchange for their dollar holdings. De Gaulle openly questioned why France should accept paper dollars for tangible goods when America could simply print more dollars at will. In August 1971, under President Georges Pompidou, France took an extraordinary step, dispatching a warship to New York to physically retrieve French gold deposits from the New York Federal Reserve. The loss of confidence was so absolute that it led to a dramatic, almost cinematic, confrontation between allies. In August 1971, French President Georges Pompidou took the extraordinary step of sending a battleship to New York. Its mission: to physically retrieve French gold deposits from the New York Federal Reserve because they no longer trusted American paper promises. This warship was the ultimate symbol that the dollar's credibility had vanished, sunk by the costs of the war. Consider the implications of this act. France, a key ally, fundamentally distrusted America's willingness to honor a simple transfer request. They felt compelled to send a warship to ensure they received their gold. This illustrates the utter collapse of confidence in the dollar. And France was not alone. The relentless drain on U.S. gold reserves culminated in the collapse of the London Gold Pool in March 1968. The London Gold Pool was a consortium of central banks that had been actively selling gold to artificially maintain the official $35 price against relentless market pressure. When speculative demand overwhelmed their capacity to supply gold at that price, the pool collapsed and a two-tier gold market emerged, an official price for central bank transactions, held at the artificial $35 level, and a much higher free market price that reflected actual supply and demand. By 1970, U.S. gold coverage had plummeted from 55% to a mere 22%. For every $100 in circulation, America possessed only $22 worth of gold to back it up. The rest was based on confidence, and that confidence was rapidly evaporating. Vietnam War expenditures were undeniably the principal driver of this catastrophic deterioration. As one analysis concluded, the continued loss of reserves as a result of the Vietnam War led to destabilizing speculation, suspension of convertibility, and depreciation of the dollar. The International Monetary Fund's retrospective analysis confirmed this, stating that the United States suffered such a balance of payments crisis mainly due to its lax domestic monetary and fiscal policies as it sought to finance the costs of the Vietnam War and the Great Society programs. So, what happens when the world's reserve currency loses credibility? What happens when the very foundation of the entire international monetary system begins to crack? On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon unilaterally suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold, effectively ending the Bretton Woods system. This Nixon shock was accompanied by a 90-day wage and price freeze and a 10% surcharge on imports. Nixon presented the decision as a temporary measure, promising reforms to the Bretton Woods system to follow. In reality, it marked the permanent transition to a fiat currency system, where money is backed by nothing but government promises and faith. The immediate aftermath was nothing short of chaos. The Bank of Japan intervened massively to prevent yen appreciation, purchasing a staggering $3 billion on August 16th and 17th alone. 2 days of frantic buying in a desperate attempt to hold back the inevitable tide. European currency markets temporarily closed. Finance ministers frantically convened emergency meetings. The entire architecture of post-war international finance had been demolished with a single announcement. The December 1971 Smithsonian Agreement attempted to salvage a modified fixed exchange rate system, with the dollar devalued to $38 per ounce of gold, a 7.9% devaluation. Other countries agreed to appreciate their currencies against the dollar within plus or minus 25% trading bands. President Nixon hailed it as the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world. It lasted a mere 14 months. The Smithsonian Agreement quickly proved unworkable. The continued weakness of the dollar, driven by ongoing fiscal deficits and persistent inflation, necessitated further devaluation in February 1973. At that point, Japan and the European Economic Community abandoned the effort and transitioned to floating exchange rates. The Bretton Woods era was definitively over. The longer-term consequences were profound and far-reaching. Under the new floating rate system, the dollar plunged by 1/3 during the 1970s and became subject to enormous speculative pressures. Currency traders could now openly bet against the dollar, and they did so repeatedly. Exchange rates gyrated wildly, injecting considerable uncertainty and cost into international trade. However, perhaps the darkest implication of the collapse of Bretton Woods was that it removed a crucial constraint on deficit spending. Under the gold standard, countries that ran persistent deficits were forced to tighten policy or risk depleting their gold reserves. Under floating rates, America could run deficits indefinitely, simply printing more dollars and allowing the exchange rate to absorb the adjustment. The fiscal discipline that gold had imposed was gone. This enabled the fiscal profligacy that would come to characterize subsequent decades. Without the gold constraint, politicians could spend without limit, finance wars without taxation, and promise benefits without adequately funding them. The check that Bretton Woods had placed on government fiscal irresponsibility had been removed, and the Vietnam War spending was the expenditure that broke that check. This wasn't just a technical adjustment in global banking. It was the birth of a hidden tax that every American pays to this day. By severing the link to gold, the government gained the power to print money to fund forever wars without asking for your vote or your tax increase. This is inflation, the silent thief. When you wonder why your wages haven't kept pace with the cost of housing or groceries since the 1970s, look back to 1970. The financial logic of the Vietnam War effectively socialized the cost of conflict by devaluing the currency in your pocket. The death of the gold standard wasn't just a technical change in banking. It was the final victory for a system that demanded unchecked spending for perpetual war. Let's examine the scale of the monetary collapse with some precision. U.S. gold reserves stood at approximately $23 billion in 1950, enough to cover roughly 65% of foreign dollar holdings. By 1960, gold reserves had fallen to approximately $17.8 billion, while foreign dollar holdings had surged to over $20 billion. The coverage ratio had already fallen below 100%. By 1978, at the peak of Vietnam War spending, U.S. gold reserves had declined to approximately $10.4 billion, while foreign dollar holdings had exploded to exceed $47 billion. The coverage ratio had collapsed to approximately 22%. For every $100 held by foreign governments and banks, America had only $22 in gold to back it. The London Gold Pool sold approximately 400 tons of gold in the first quarter of 1968 alone, desperately attempting to maintain the official price of $35 per ounce against overwhelming speculative buying. When the pool collapsed in March, the free market gold price immediately surged to over $44 per ounce, a 26% premium over the official price. By August 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window, U.S. gold reserves stood at approximately $10.2 billion, essentially unchanged from 1968, while foreign dollar holdings had exploded to over $70 billion. The theoretical coverage ratio had plummeted to approximately 45%. The system had become mathematically unsustainable. The subsequent dollar devaluations reveal the magnitude of adjustment required. The December 1971 Smithsonian Agreement devalued the dollar by 9% against gold. The February 1973 devaluation added another 10%. In total, the dollar had been devalued by approximately 17% against gold in just 14 months, the largest monetary realignment since the 1930s. Against major currencies, the depreciation was even more severe. Between 1971 and 1980, the dollar declined approximately 33% on a trade-weighted basis against other major currencies. The German mark appreciated approximately 60% against the dollar. The Japanese yen appreciated approximately 37%. The Swiss franc appreciated a staggering 95%. However, while the monetary system was collapsing, another crisis was brewing: inflation. And the Vietnam War was pouring gasoline on that fire. 2. The Vietnam War's inflationary impact began in 1965. As military spending accelerated dramatically, the numbers tell a stark story. Inflation averaged under 2% annually from 1960 through 1960. Then, it began its relentless climb after the military buildup, reaching 3% in 1966, 7% in 1968, and nearly 5% in 1969. This marked the beginning of what economists now call the Great Inflation, which would continue to ravage the American economy until 1981. For 16 long years, inflation eroded savings, distorted investment decisions, fueled labor unrest, and undermined confidence in the future. And it all started with Vietnam. The inflationary mechanism was a straightforward case of demand-pull economics. Government spending to prosecute the war effort was layered on top of total spending in the economy, creating demand for war goods and generating higher incomes that would then be spent on non-military goods and services, more dollars chasing the same amount of civilian goods. Textbook inflation. The timing is unmistakable in the data. After decreasing in 1964, all defense indicators increased dramatically in 1965. Military prime contracts increased by 5%. Manufacturers' new orders in defense products, industries jumped by a staggering 5%. Progress payments, outstanding surged by 9%. By 1966, the pace of the buildup accelerated even further. Annual rates of increase in defense indicators far exceeded the growth rate of the gross national product (GDP), with most advanced indicators showing their largest increases. The buildup continued through 1967, when increased military purchases accounted for 9% of GDP increases for the year. A full quarter of all economic growth was directly attributable to war spending. However, the truly destructive nature of this inflation stemmed from a critical contextual factor. The escalation occurred in an economy already operating near full capacity. By 1960, the capacity utilization rate for manufacturing was at its highest level since World War II, exceeding even the rates during the Korean War. The unemployment rate had decreased to 5% by 1969, the lowest since World War II, with the exception of the Korean War period, operating above capacity. The economy simply could not absorb unanticipated increases in aggregate demand without triggering significant price increases. There was no slack to take up. Factories were already running 3 shifts a day. Unemployment was already minimal. When you pour massive government spending into an economy already operating at full capacity, prices have nowhere to go but up. The wholesale price index for producer finished goods increased by 2% in 1965, 5% in 1966, and 9% in 1967. However, certain categories saw particularly sharp increases. The Fabricated Metal Products Index increased by 4% in 1966 and 3% in 1967. The Machinery and Equipment Index jumped by 2% in 1966 and a staggering 2% in 1967. These dramatic price increases reflected severe supply constraints in industries critical to war production. When the government suddenly demands massive quantities of helicopters, aircraft, vehicles, electronics, and ammunition, Manufacturers simply cannot instantly expand production. They bid workers away from other industries with higher wages. They bid materials away from civilian uses with higher prices. The resulting scarcity inevitably manifests as inflation. Tightened labor markets, fueled by both economic expansion and the military draft, led to accelerated wage increases. Average hourly compensation averaged just under 4% annual increases from 1960 through 1965, but jumped to an average of 6% from 1966 through 1970. Negotiated wage increases accelerated from 7% in 1965 to averages exceeding 6% in subsequent years. These wage push effects amplified the demand pull inflation, creating a self-reinforcing spiral. Workers demanded higher wages to compensate for rising prices. Employers granted higher wages and passed the increased costs along as higher prices. Workers then demanded even higher wages. Round and round the cycle went, with prices and wages chasing each other ever upward, and the purchasing power of the dollar eroding month by month. The Federal Reserve's response to this crisis was severely constrained by political considerations. Fed Chairman Arthur Burns recognized the inflationary threat, but President Lyndon B. Johnson relentlessly pressured the Fed to maintain an accommodative monetary policy to support both the war effort and his ambitious Great Society programs. The Fed attempted to modestly reduce money growth in late 1966, despite rising deficits. However, the intensely political environment made sustained restrictive policy impossible. Furthermore, Johnson's steadfast refusal to request tax increases until 1967 effectively eliminated the possibility of fiscal policy offsetting the inflationary stimulus. Even after finally proposing a tax surcharge, congressional resistance delayed implementation for over a year. By the time the 10% surcharge finally took effect in mid-1968, inflation had become deeply entrenched in the American economy. The political economy at play here is particularly revealing. Johnson understood that raising taxes to pay for an increasingly unpopular war would be political suicide. As documented in the book, War and Taxes, raising taxes in the wake of prior tax cuts for Vietnam threatened to shatter the fragile coalition Johnson had painstakingly built around his Great Society initiatives. So, he made a fateful choice. He chose inflation, the hidden tax that nobody votes on, that silently transfers wealth from savers to borrowers, and from workers to the government. Inflation is always and everywhere a political choice, and Johnson chose it. But perhaps the greatest cost of the Vietnam War was what didn't happen, what America might have become with different priorities, and that brings us to the tragic death of the Great Society. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society represented the most ambitious domestic agenda since the New Deal. The stated goal was nothing less than the wholesale transformation of American society, the eradication of poverty, the expansion of educational opportunity, universal medical care for the elderly and the poor, comprehensive urban renewal, and the attainment of genuine racial justice. The legislative achievements of the Great Society were sweeping and unprecedented. The Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, Medicare and Medicaid, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Housing and Urban Development Act. Dozens of initiatives bloomed, each a promise etched in the heady days of the mid-1960s, each declaring war on problems that had stubbornly resisted solutions for generations. These were not mere policy tweaks, but grand designs intended to reshape the very fabric of American society. Martha Bailey and Andrew Goodman Bacon meticulously dissected the distribution of Economic Opportunity Act EOA funds, revealing a telling pattern. The Johnson administration, fresh from its landslide victory and emboldened by its vision of a great society, channeled resources to areas where poverty festered most acutely and where non-white populations struggled under the weight of systemic disadvantages. This allocation, they found, aligned strikingly with the War on Poverty's stated objectives, a clear indication of initial intent. Unlike the New Deal's spending, which often navigated the treacherous currents of political patronage and compromise, the EOA funding decisions seemed remarkably immune to such influences. Politics. surprisingly, explained very little of the variation in where the money went. This suggested a genuine, almost idealistic commitment to attacking poverty at its roots through targeted resource allocation. A sincere effort to level the playing field. But the dream soon collided with a brutal reality: the rapidly escalating costs of the Vietnam War. Johnson, a shrewd politician, understood the inherent contradiction. He knew, deep down, that he couldn't fully realize his ambitious Great Society while simultaneously pouring billions into a distant and increasingly unpopular war. He was trapped. He was unwilling to withdraw from Vietnam, fearing that any perceived retreat would brand him as weak. A fatal blow to his political standing. The result was a slow, agonizing strangulation of domestic programs. Budget constraints tightened it like a vice, and inflation, fueled by war spending, eroded the real value of every dollar allocated. Consider the timeline. 1964, the Economic Opportunity Act passes, a beacon of hope, officially launching the war on poverty. Medicare and Medicaid become law, a monumental step towards providing health care for elderly and impoverished Americans. But also in 1965, the first major combat troop deployments to Vietnam begin, a quiet prelude to a storm. 1966, the Model Cities program, an ambitious attempt to address urban decay, is unveiled. Simultaneously, Vietnam costs exceed $10 billion annually, a staggering sum, and inflation begins its relentless climb. By 1967, the collision was inevitable. The administration faced a stark, unavoidable choice: scale back the war or scale back the Great Society. Johnson, ever the optimist, refused to choose, betting he could somehow sustain both. It was a gamble that failed spectacularly. War costs continued their inexorable rise, fueled by escalating troop levels and the insatiable demands of the battlefield. Inflation, like a corrosive acid, ate away at the real value of domestic spending. Programs that looked generous on paper delivered less and less in practice. As the dollar's purchasing power withered, a narrative began to take hold. A dark seed of doubt planted in the public consciousness. Aid to the poor, many argued, would not only fail to solve poverty, but would actively encourage dependency. This argument, once relegated to the fringes, gained traction as war costs mounted and fiscal constraints tightened. As taxpayers began to question the wisdom of throwing good money after bad, the idealistic vision of 1964, the belief that America was wealthy enough to eradicate poverty if it simply chose to do so, ran headlong into the grim reality of war expenditures, consuming resources that might have funded that transformation. The opportunity costs extended far beyond social programs. They encompassed basic infrastructure, the sinews of a modern economy, and investments in human capital, the very foundation of future prosperity. The billions poured into military operations in Vietnam could have been invested in education, creating a more skilled and productive workforce. They could have been used to build modern transportation and communication networks, connecting communities and fostering economic growth. They could have fueled scientific research, unlocking new technologies and industries. They could have strengthened public health, improving the well-being of all Americans. The foregone possibilities are staggering, a testament to the war's profound impact. Edward Miguel and Gerard Rowland's comprehensive study of the long-run impact of bombing in Vietnam reveals lasting negative effects on the local population, economic activity, poverty rates, literacy, infrastructure, and population density. Decades after the war ended, if the war imposed such devastating and enduring costs on Vietnamese society, it's reasonable, indeed imperative, to infer comparable effects on American economic potential through the systematic diversion of resources from productive investment. The contrast with post-war Germany and Japan is instructive. Marshall Plan aid, combined with strategic domestic investment in infrastructure and education, enabled rapid economic recovery and sustained growth in both countries, transforming them into economic powerhouses. Vietnam War spending, by contrast, produced no comparable domestic benefits. The $140 billion spent on the war a colossal sum in its day, represented an enormous opportunity cost, a lost chance to build a better America with no offsetting gain. While America's best engineers were building bombers, its future competitors were building the modern world. Japan and Germany, restricted from massive military spending, funneled their talent and capital into civilian manufacturing, while the best and brightest American engineers worked for Boeing and Lockheed. Japan's engineers at Sony and Toyota were perfecting cars and electronics that would eventually crush the American auto and consumer goods industries in the 1970s and 80s. But the erosion of American industrial dominance didn't stop at the factory gates of Sony or Toyota. While the military-industrial complex thrived, the civilian heart of America, cities like Detroit, began to hollow out. Investment capital is finite. Every dollar and every genius engineer focused on making a bomber more lethal was a resource denied to making a car more reliable or a factory more automated. This shift marked the beginning of America's transition from a production-based powerhouse to a debt-driven service economy, a structural scar that remains unhealed today. The war's opportunity costs were particularly severe for America's cities, already teetering on the brink of crisis. The 1960s urban crisis, characterized by deteriorating housing, inadequate schools, chronic unemployment, and simmering racial tensions, demanded massive and sustained investment. Johnson's Model Cities program and the Housing and Urban Development Act aimed to address these challenges, to breathe new life into struggling urban centers. However, escalating war costs forced drastic cutbacks in urban aid precisely when needs were greatest. A cruel irony. The timing could not have been worse. The civil rights movement had raised expectations among African Americans for meaningful economic progress, for a tangible share of the American dream. The Watts riots of 1965 and subsequent urban unrest reflected a growing frustration with persistent poverty, systemic discrimination, and the slow pace of change. Johnson's inability to deliver on the war on poverty's promises, largely due to Vietnam's insatiable fiscal drain, contributed directly to social instability and eroded confidence in the government's capacity to address deep-seated domestic problems. The long-term consequences were devastating: deteriorating urban infrastructure, declining public schools, concentrated poverty in inner cities, and the emergence of an urban underclass, trapped in a cycle of despair. While multiple factors contributed to these outcomes, the fiscal constraints imposed by Vietnam War spending effectively eliminated the possibility of the massive public investment that might have prevented or at least mitigated these tragic developments. The economic cost of this failure, measured in lost productivity, increased crime, reduced educational achievement, and widespread social dysfunction, has been enormous and tragically ongoing. Meanwhile, the war was also quietly but inexorably destroying America's position in international trade, a process with consequences that would reverberate long after the last helicopter lifted off from the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Before the mid-1960s, the United States had maintained either a comfortable trade surplus or a manageable small deficit, a sign of economic strength and global competitiveness. The Vietnam War fundamentally altered this position, transforming America from a creditor nation to a debtor nation. The war's impact on the balance of payments stemmed from multiple channels: direct military expenditures abroad, the cost of maintaining troops and bases overseas, drained dollars from the U.S. economy, induced expenditures for imported raw materials and intermediate goods, necessary to fuel the war machine, further widened the trade deficit, reduced export competitiveness as resources were diverted to war production, further exacerbated the problem. The balance of payments data provides a stark illustration of the timing and magnitude of the deterioration. The capital account deficit peaked in 1963-64, then improved briefly due to the imposition of capital controls, before deteriorating again as the war intensified. The current account oscillated increasingly wildly around its underlying trend, reflecting the relentless pressure of war-induced demand on the external accounts. By 1967, continued deterioration reflected mounting demand pressure as the budget deficit widened. Monetary policy remained accommodative. and labor markets tightened, creating inflationary pressures. The subsequent improvement in 1968 to 69 was driven by fiscal and monetary tightening, a belated attempt to regain control of the situation, but it came too late to restore confidence in the dollar. War-related dollar outflows contributed directly to the growth of eurodollar markets. Vast pools of dollar-denominated deposits held in banks outside the United States. These offshore dollar holdings represented potential claims on U.S. gold reserves, creating a dollar overhang that severely undermined confidence in the Bretton Woods system. The post-war international monetary order. As more dollars accumulated abroad relative to U.S. gold reserves, the likelihood of a run on the dollar, a catastrophic loss of confidence, increased exponentially. The dollar's role as the world's international reserve currency gave the United States what French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing famously termed an exorbitant privilege, the unique ability to finance its deficits by essentially printing the world's reserve currency. However, this privilege came with profound responsibilities. The United States was expected to maintain price stability and fiscal discipline to preserve confidence in the dollar, to ensure its continued acceptance as the bedrock of the international financial system. Vietnam War financing flagrantly violated these expectations, undermining the very foundations of the Bretton Woods system. The crisis atmosphere intensified in 1967 to 68 as it became increasingly clear that U.S. gold reserves were woefully inadequate to honor potential conversion requests. Should foreign holders of dollars lose faith and demand gold? The London gold pool's collapse in March 1968, a dramatic event, demonstrated that private markets had already lost confidence in the official gold price, signaling the beginning of the end. A two-tier gold market emerged, a desperate attempt to maintain a semblance of order, with an official price for central bank transactions and a much higher free market price, reflecting the true forces of supply and demand. This unsustainable arrangement set the stage for Nixon's momentous and ultimately unavoidable decision in 1971 to close the gold window, severing the dollar's last remaining link to gold. The Bretton Woods collapse ushered in a period of competitive currency, devaluations, and trade conflicts, a chaotic and uncertain era. The Smithsonian Agreement of December 1971 represented a desperate attempt to salvage the system through negotiated realignment, but it proved temporary, a fragile bandage on a gaping wound. The shift to floating exchange rates, a radical departure from the fixed exchange rate regime of Bretton Woods, removed an important discipline on fiscal and monetary policy. Under Bretton Woods, balance of payments concerns constrained deficit spending, forcing policymakers to exercise caution. Floating rates eliminated this constraint, enabling the persistent deficits and monetary expansion that characterized subsequent decades, paving the way for a new era of economic instability. While the war eventually ended on the battlefield, its financial legacy created a permanent rupture in American fiscal responsibility that we are still grappling with today. The economic consequences didn't simply vanish when Saigon fell in 1975. The war left legacies that would burden America for generations, casting a long shadow over the nation's future. The Vietnam War left a lasting fiscal legacy, a heavy weight on the nation's balance sheet. Analysis of debt and taxes across 8 U.S. wars reveals a striking pattern. Except for Vietnam, the federal government systematically reduced the debt-to-GDP ratio during the 12 to 15-year post-war period after every major conflict, demonstrating a commitment to fiscal responsibility. Vietnam shattered this pattern, breaking the mold. Rather than being paid down, war-related debt persisted and grew, as subsequent administrations ran continued deficits, perpetuating a cycle of borrowing and spending. The traditional shift from wartime deficit financing to peacetime fiscal discipline simply did not occur after Vietnam. Several factors explain this failure. First, the lack of a clear victory. The ambiguous and ultimately unsatisfying conclusion to the war made it politically difficult to frame post-war policy as a triumphant return to normalcy. Second, the war's deep unpopularity meant limited public support for the sacrifices needed to pay down the debt. for the tax increases and spending cuts that would have been required. Third, the collapse of Bretton Woods removed a crucial external constraint on deficit spending, freeing policymakers from the need to maintain a stable exchange rate. Finally, the economic challenges of the 1970s, stagflation, oil shocks, deindustrialization, created intense political pressures for continued deficit spending as politicians sought to cushion the blow of economic hardship. Defense contractors developed sophisticated lobbying operations, cultivating close relationships with congressional leaders, and strategically situating facilities across multiple districts to build broad political support, making it difficult to challenge their interests. The revolving door between the Pentagon and the defense industry grew increasingly permeable, blurring the lines between public service and private gain. Military officers and defense officials transitioned seamlessly into lucrative industry positions, while defense executives moved into government roles, often overseeing the very companies they had recently led or would rejoin in the future, creating a conflict of interest. This iron triangle of defense contractors, military services, and congressional committees created powerful institutional resistance to reducing military spending, even long after the war had ended, perpetuating a culture of military spending. The crowding out of civilian investment had lasting effects on American economic competitiveness, hindering innovation and growth. Resources devoted to military production couldn't simultaneously be invested in civilian industries, creating a zero-sum game. The militarization of the American economy created inefficiencies, diverting engineering and scientific talent from civilian innovation and contributing to the relative decline of American manufacturing competitiveness vis-à-vis Germany and Japan, which invested far more heavily in civilian industries. The human costs of the war, the lives lost and the futures shattered, translated directly into long-term economic burdens. Over 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam, their lives cut short in a distant and controversial war. Hundreds of thousands more were wounded, both physically and psychologically, carrying the scars of the conflict for the rest of their lives. For the generation left at home, the war wasn't just an economic statistic. It was a psychological nightmare. While the military-industrial complex was a cash cow for some, it created a survivor's guilt for millions of American youths. High school graduations became scenes of protest, with peace symbols on mortarboards. The nightly news didn't just report numbers. It added a death count that felt like a sports score, creating a society so divided that fathers disowned sons and landlords evicted tenants over their stance on a war that wouldn't end. But there was a bizarre, unintended modernization happening amidst the destruction. The RMK-BRJ consortium, known as the Vietnam Builders, didn't just build bases. They trained 200,000 Vietnamese workers in advanced construction and administration. It was a strange irony. While American bombs were leveling Vietnamese cities, American contractors were inadvertently creating a skilled labor force that would eventually help rebuild the nation's industry decades late. These calculations, however, likely understate the true costs, as they omit the intangible but very real effects of psychological trauma, addiction, family disruption, and other difficult-to-quantify consequences. Veterans' benefits and services created an ongoing fiscal obligation, a long-term commitment to those who had served their country. Unlike World War II veterans, who largely reintegrated successfully into civilian life, and the booming post-war economy, Vietnam veterans faced a hostile or indifferent public reception, high unemployment rates, substance abuse problems, and inadequate mental health services, a tragic failure to support those who had borne the brunt of the war. The economic costs of supporting disabled veterans and their families extended decades beyond the war's conclusion. A continuous drain on public resources, Agent Orange, and other toxic exposures created additional long-term health costs, inflicting lasting damage on veterans and their families. The full economic burden of these health effects, including lost productivity, medical expenses, and the burdens of family care, likely totaled billions of dollars, a testament to the war's devastating consequences. The war also contributed to the breakdown of the post-war economic consensus around Keynesian demand management and government activism, undermining the intellectual foundations of the New Deal order. The guns and butter failure. The inability to simultaneously finance a major war and ambitious social programs discredited the idea that government could successfully manage the economy to achieve full employment without triggering inflation, challenging the core tenets of Keynesian economics. The stagflation of the 1970s, the seemingly paradoxical combination of high inflation and high unemployment, seemed to vindicate critics who argued that Keynesian policies created more problems than they solved, fueling skepticism towards government intervention. This ideological shift had profound consequences, reshaping the economic landscape. The decline of Keynesian economics as the dominant macroeconomic framework opened space for monetarist and later new classical approaches that emphasized market mechanisms over government intervention, advocating for deregulation and limited government spending. The Reagan Revolution of the 1980s, with its emphasis on tax cuts, deregulation, and reduced domestic spending while maintaining high military budgets, represented the political culmination of this ideological transformation, a decisive shift away from the New Deal consensus. Even the most modern weapons became a source of double-dipping profits. The F-4 Phantom, being the workhorse of the Air Force, was rushed into productions with unreliable engines and malfunctioning weapon systems. Instead of fixing these flaws for free, McDonnell Douglas charged the military hundreds of millions of dollars for upgrade packages to fix their own mistakes. The rush for profit also created a dangerous culture of optimism that bypassed scientific reality. This led to a phenomenon called concurrence, forcing weapons like the F-4 Phantom and later the F-22 into full production before their technology was even proven. Contractors and government managers often ignored failed tests or even falsified data to keep the money flowing. They preferred to build a flawed machine first and then charge the government again to fix their own mistakes. Pilots were dying because of these flaws, while the corporation profited twice from the same aircraft. The fiscal crisis created by financing the war through deficit spending rather than taxation triggered runaway inflation that eroded Americans' purchasing power and ultimately destroyed the Bretton Woods international monetary system, undermining the stability of the global economy. The decision to pursue both guns and butter, to simultaneously finance a major war and ambitious domestic social programs without adequate taxation, was politically expedient in the short term, but economically catastrophic in the long term, a Faustian bargain. The opportunity costs, what America might have become with different priorities, may represent the greatest economic burden of all, the unrealized potential. The Great Society programs that might have transformed American society, eradicating poverty and creating a more equitable society, were strangled by war costs, starved of the resources they needed to succeed. Infrastructure investments that might have maintained American competitiveness, ensuring the nation's economic dominance in the 21st century, were foregone. Human capital that might have driven innovation, propelling America to new heights of technological advancement, was destroyed in the jungles of Southeast Asia, a tragic waste of talent and potential. The long-term fiscal burdens persisted long after the war ended, continuing to weigh on the American economy. Unlike previous wars, Vietnam-related debt was never paid down, a departure from historical norms. The pattern of persistent deficits established during the war became normalized, accepted as the new normal. The constraint on military spending that fiscal responsibility had previously imposed was permanently broken, paving the way for future military interventions. This analysis doesn't claim that economic factors alone explain American involvement in Vietnam. Ideological anti-communism, Cold War geopolitics, domestic political considerations, bureaucratic momentum, and individual decisions all played crucial roles in shaping the course of the war. But economic structures, incentives, and constraints were fundamental rather than peripheral to the war's trajectory, shaping the context in which those decisions were made. The Vietnam War demonstrated that even superpowers face economic constraints, that resources are finite and choices must be made. The belief that America could afford both guns and butter proved illusory, a dangerous delusion. The war's economic costs, direct and indirect, short-term and long-term, tangible and intangible, far exceeded official estimates and created distortions that reverberated for decades. reshaping the American economy and society. The lessons for the present are sobering. A warning against the allure of military intervention. Wars remain expensive, consuming vast resources and diverting attention from pressing domestic needs. Their true costs are systematically underestimated, often hidden beneath layers of accounting and political spin, and the economic structures that benefit from conflict create powerful constituencies for its continuation, perpetuating a cycle of violence and waste. The financial engineering that sustained American involvement in Vietnam, deficit spending, monetary expansion, hidden costs, and deferred obligations has been replicated in subsequent conflicts with similar results: fiscal stress, monetary instability, reduced domestic investment, and long-term economic burdens that outlast the wars themselves, burdening future generations. As we look at the headlines of today, from Ukraine to the Middle East, the echoes of Vietnam are unmistakable. The financial engineering perfected in the 1960s deficit spending, the revolving door, and cost-plus contracts is the standard operating procedure for modern conflict. We must ask ourselves, is the goal of our foreign policy to secure peace, or is it to ensure the quarterly earnings of defense contractors? Understanding the dark financial logic of Vietnam is not just a history lesson. It is a survival guide for the 21st century. Before we fund the next billion-dollar conflict, we must decide if we are willing to let our future be consumed by a system designed to profit from perpetual war. The Vietnam War reveals how economic systems and financial imperatives can capture and distort policy towards catastrophic ends, driving nations towards self-destruction. The dark financial logic that drove the war operated largely outside democratic accountability, with costs diffused and hidden, while benefits were concentrated among defense contractors, the military establishment, and other organized interests, undermining democratic principles. The question isn't whether the Vietnam War was a military failure. History has already made that clear. The more insidious question we must ask is whether it served as a flawless economic engine for the very institutions designed to profit from it. When viewed through that lens, the war functioned with chilling, mathematical precision, exactly as intended. A staggering $140 billion extracted from the pockets of hardworking taxpayers flowed directly into the coffers of private contractors. The military-industrial complex, once a solemn warning, became a permanent, unshakable fixture of the American landscape. The traditional constraints on deficit spending were shattered, paving the way for future unchecked expenditures. In its own twisted way, the system achieved its intended purpose. It wasn't a flaw, it was a fundamental design element. If this exploration of hidden economic currents has piqued your interest, delve deeper with the next video on your screen, and be sure to subscribe for regular, in-depth analyses of economic history, uncovering the stories behind the numbers. Subscribe now for more deep dives into the past, and then proceed to the next video for further insights.